But welcome and thank you everyone for making time. I know everybody's pretty busy with their lives and work and everything else that matters. So I'll introduce myself real quickly. I'm Thabo Ngalo. I'm founding and managing partner of Eighth Season Capital, and I'll tell you a little bit about what we do in a second. But we essentially focus on venture capital, startups, and other sort of investment advisory work. So I think let me jump right into the presentation. I think it's going to help us also do a bit of the intro from my end as well. If you'll give me a quick second to share my screen. Who's investing in African startups? So I was introducing myself, I guess, as Eighth Season Capital. And essentially what we do is we offer a service where we provide almost, I'm going to call it an intermediary service between investors and startups that are looking for capital. So it could be primarily tech startups, but a whole range of startups that exist both in SA and across the continent. And then secondly, we also connect investors who have capital and are looking for opportunities in Africa with opportunities in the venture capital and the startup space. So that's the kind of background we kind of provide as Eighth Season. But in the middle of that, what we also do is invest directly in the funds. So we run a fund currently called Future Build Ventures. And that fund invests directly in tech startups from, I'm going to call it between 1 million Rand and 5 million Rand. And that fund we're looking to close ultimately at about 200 million Rand is the total fund size. So I sort of play in those kind of spaces, and I'm more than happy to to have further discussions with with anybody I guess in the space or looking to deploy capital, I guess, in the startup space from an advisory perspective as well. And as I mentioned, we do all this fund investing through a fund of fund model. And what that is essentially is we pool capital and invest it in a variety of funds. So very a tough investment model, but I guess it's something we signed up for, and it's something we have to deliver on. So welcome everybody. I guess maybe just in terms of just to kick off, if you've got any questions or any comments, please pop them in the chat. I'm hoping you're able to see to access the chat and the Q&A. So any questions or comments, just pop them in there, and then hopefully I'll get them addressed as I'm chatting as well. I'll try to sort of skip between the two of speaking and then seeing if there are any sort of hardcore issues or popping up on the chat. So guys, I'm gonna jump into it. So what I thought we chat about today, and this is the second of our webinar we're doing. We did one at the end of Q1, looking at the landscape, and what we thought we'd look at in this one, which I think is really important, particularly as a fund investor, is around who's investing, with the kind of the profile of investors, and then also maybe to show you guys a couple of names that might be useful for you as a startup, to maybe try to see how you can shape your own investment strategy as you approach these funders and funds that are out there at the moment. And then also look at some of the wealthy guys and the lower end of the investment chain as to how you can also access those. So that's kind of what I want to cover over the next probably 45 minutes, and hopefully we can have a couple of minutes to chat and address any questions or issues if there are any. I hope everybody can see my slides okay. Please give me a thumbs up. Yeah, if anybody can see it. If you don't see it, just shout as well. But so super, there we go. Oh, got one at least. Yeah. So guys, I think the most important thing, I think, one from my perspective, coming out of the investment management industry, is that we find that a lot of guys who want to raise money in Africa actually don't understand how to raise money in Africa. There are a lot of opportunities. There's a lot of money, a lot of funds in Africa. You can track in probably every country over 140 active investors. And when I say in every country, I mean particularly in the key four markets, South Africa, Kenya, Nigeria, Egypt. and the adjacent countries as well. You know, there tends to be a lot of activity that people don't understand or probably have access to. So one of the key things that really matter to this discussion, and I thought I'd just have this out there as an intro, is, you know, your ability to understand the investor, I'm going to call it archetype in Africa, is also super important. One, it helps you to tailor your own investment strategy, right? So how do you align your own goals as a startup, raising money with what investors want? And then if you are also an investor, how do you tailor your own investment strategy to fit with what the market and the startup ecosystem is actually delivering? So I think that alignment is quite important. You find a lot of research that's out there at the moment is just on the startup world, but not so much on the investor world, you know. So we want to sort of bridge that gap and bring a little bit of hopefully some intelligence around what's going on in the space as well. Secondly, it's going to obviously help to build trust. The more investors you know, the earlier guys start raising money with particularly VCs, the better. The earlier people understand that it's not just local VCs that are active in Africa. A lot of them are based out in North America, particularly in the US, in Europe, large chunk of it, as I'll chat to you about. So the more you understand those kind of dynamics, what was going to help us unlock value and opportunities for the ecosystem. And of course, the biggest thing is the regulatory kind of stuff that hits a lot of people in the head. So you want to raise money from a fund that's domiciled in Delaware, or that's in Luxembourg. You know, now you're going to hit same requirements if you are based in Kenya, if you're based in Nigeria or South Africa, particularly South Africa, in how you have those regulatory discussions and where you domicile stuff. So, you know, that's quite important that that everybody understands the background of this webinar, that, you know, we want to get guys ready, and not just getting startups ready, but getting investors ready as well, because there's a massive chasm, if you want to call it that, between, you know, people who are looking for capital and people who are providing capital. And a lot of these opportunities exist for us to sort of look at. So what I thought for like, if you indulge me for about 5-10 minutes, just to chat a little bit about what's been going on in the space around the investment trends, you know, what's popping in terms of the sectors that are most active or been the most active in the first half, and then we'll look a little bit backwards, hopefully going back before we get into the crux of the discussion, which is why everybody's here. Maybe let me pause here. Are there any questions, any issues? Please just pop them in the chat. Feel free to stop me if I'm talking too fast, but yeah, hopefully we can get into the numbers and the details in a minute. So if you sort of take a bit of a step back in terms of what's been happening in the funding ecosystem, we're essentially in what everybody calls the funding winter. You can see the very last call it bar on 2024 on the right, in that colorful chart. This numbers by Brighter Bridges, which is one of the research houses that gives us a lot of info on African startup data. Numbers have fallen. You know, we are nowhere near where we were, call it, you know, peak of last year or even 2022. And that should be expected, kind of thing, you know, because we do have a global venture capital, call it, you know, winter. Everyone calls it the funding winter. A bit of a dry up. So unfortunately, it's going to affect everybody in the world, and that's reflected also in Africa. But I think what's important to point out here is that we're not nearly where we were 10 years ago. So you know, there are a lot of factors we can get into as to why there was this bulge that happened post-COVID. You remember post-COVID, there was a lot of free money, particularly coming out of the US, to sort of try to get the economies back to speed, and all that free money, interest rates were kind of curtailed, and all of those kind of avenues fueled this you know, growth. And of course, venture capital, particularly in Africa, always has a lag. So you'll find there's almost a 2 to 3 year lag between what happens globally, with almost a 1 to 2 year lag now, maybe a little bit more correlation with what happens in global markets and what happens in Africa on the VC and private equity space. So quite important numbers to see that we have come off. The yellow bars will show you that the bulk of activity are early stage investments. So you got to pay careful attention to that. Not a lot of growth funding, call it R1 million and above, sorry, $1 million and above. And not a lot of kind of Series B, Series C funding in Africa as we'll see. So, it's been a tough period for the last year, and it's probably going to be a much, I guess, continue to be a much tougher period if you look over the next year. So these are numbers by Africa Big Data, Big Deal. And essentially this is a very noisy graph. I don't want to bore you with the details, but I think all it shows you that if you look month on month, we are in a slump from a funding perspective, but we're not as bad as we were 5 or 10 years ago. So if you kind of compare the numbers, the landscape still shows quite a lot of good growth in VC funding. And you'll see when I get into the actual funders, who the funders are, where that activities come from. So you sort of see in the second quarter of this year, and I did an update in Q1, and those numbers were obviously very soft, and they're getting a little bit softer as well. You're only seeing, kind of $350 million in funding that's gone in. To give you guys a bit of perspective, at the peak, when I say we as Africa as a continent, the entire continent, when we're doing about $4 billion in startup funding, the US was calling about 200 and even a little bit more. Canada, I think, was at about 10 billion. So those are the kind of I think 10 billion in a quarter even for the likes of Canada. So it kind of shows you the in relative terms where we are as a continent versus the rest of the world in our levels of funding. So the 350 million could actually just be one transaction in a small little startup in the US. From a Series C. So it's still a very small, I guess, ecosystem, unfortunately, but the same sort of continues. So if you sort of looked what we've raised in the first half of the year, just under $800 million has been raised. And I think the most interesting thing is, and I'll chat a little bit about this as we go along in a minute, has been this trend toward debt funding. That as the valuations have come off a lot, you've seen a lot more percentage of funding coming out of venture debt versus pure equity. So you kind of seeing this 2/3 into equity, 1/3 into debt, whereas historically that number was at about 15-17%. From a debt perspective, and the balance was in equity. So that sort of speaks to what you're kind of seeing in valuations, right? So when valuations are a lot lower, I mean, why issue equity, obviously? So you're finding a lot more guys, startups, especially bigger guys in the growth side, who would have gone for maybe a Series B, deciding instead to sort of go the venture debt route, so that's quite important to also understand in terms of the kind of shifts we've been seeing in the system. And these are some of the larger transactions. Interestingly, there was a massive, pretty large transaction out of Benin. If you guys don't know where Benin is on the African continent, it's right next to Nigeria. Small little strip between Togo and Nigeria and Ghana. Very interesting transaction that came out of it, M-Copper, et cetera, that have been driving some of the 780. But activity-wise, I think it's been really muted, to be frank, as we've seen. And yeah, these are some of the numbers I think we've been seeing. From a sector perspective, these are just numbers up until end of May. Obviously, we'll get them updated when Maxime and the team sort of get the numbers out for end of June. But it's not going to change too much that, fintech continues to be, a key attractor of capital in the startup space. Of course, some of these around logistics and transport have been moved by the deals that I just showed you in the last slide. So one transaction happens $2 million, of course, it swings the sector quite a bit. But what's also been interesting is a large a swing towards clean tech or energy, water, and agri solutions that are more green. And that's also driven by the kind of money we are seeing coming into the startup space. So where you see a lot of European DFIs coming in, they tend to have a lot stronger mandates around investing in clean technology, agriculture and so forth. And that's where a lot of the money kind of tends to go. So the investor clientele is also as important, as I mentioned at the beginning, for everybody to understand. But I guess things like edtech, B2B services, those will continue to be the bread basket, I guess, of the startup ecosystem. And we're probably going to continue to see all of those going out there. Okay, so that's sort of what's been happening, very tough area. So I thought I'd jump in a little bit now into, the types of investors we've seen who are most active, and then I'll jump into a few names. I won't bore you with the stuff you probably know, but overwhelmingly, out of the databases we update and capture, I've ranked this out in terms of amount of activity, and this is exactly how the numbers are shaping up. You've got a lot of the VCs that are super active in terms of deals numbers. Corporates are super active as well, and you're finding a lot more companies actually delving into venture investing. So to give a few examples, in South Africa, the likes of Old Mutual now have a corporate venture wing. I think it's Next 167. Next 176. Apologies. We all know about Naspers. That's been super active, but of course, Exitate Foundry, MTN, Standard Bank, etc., ShopRite, Pick n Pay, all of these guys in South Africa. In Nigeria, you look at banks like Access Bank, GT Bank, across Egypt, the big corporates, GB Auto, for instance, is very active in the VC space. Some of the big banks in Egypt are super active. So you're finding a lot of the activities, and I'll show you in a couple of minutes where some of these names play. Names like MasterCard pop up quite a bit. So it's super active it's super important, I think, to understand where the activity is. So when you're raising money, to kind of know who to target. And then secondly, if you are a fund as well, to kind of understand who you can collaborate with from a co-investment perspective, from looking at deal flow, and all sorts of other great partnerships that will pop up. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about these investment holding companies. Lots of those are very active in the space, but you'll never hear about them on TechCrunch. You're not going to hear about them on now Venture Burn when they do their deals, because they keep them very quiet, but they're very active. Some of them are family owned, some of them are privately held as investment holding companies. Some of them are actually listed businesses that have private holding venture wings that we've managed to crack into, and all of these guys are super active, but you probably don't know until you actually get the access to the databases. And then of course, high net worth angel investors, all of those guys are super important to talk about as well. So I'm gonna jump into straight away. Who are the top investors? Like I think I promised. So the bulk of it, as a precursor, I guess, to the actual names, is that the bulk of what you find is the bulk of activity. Almost I'm gonna say 60% of it comes between African-based firms and American US firms. So when you sort of start looking for capital as a tech business, it's pretty important that you understand that a lot of US-based funds that are super active in Africa. And a lot of these funds, they could be started by people from, the African diaspora. So somebody who might have been born in Cameroon or Nigeria or Kenya, start a fund in the US and invest back into Africa. But that's obviously a fund that's domiciled in the US. You're also finding a lot of big names like Partech as an example. I guess US-European kind of split, but they sort of set up an Africa fund that focuses specifically on investing in Africa. So So there's a lot of that mix where you're finding a lot of North American money, or I guess vehicles that are able to attract North American money. About a quarter of the money we've been seeing comes from Europe. We can imagine from an Africa perspective, we've got a very close affinity and relationship with Europe historically. Time zone wise, it makes sense. Lots of people, live in Paris in Africa, live in London in Africa, or Amsterdam in Africa, as it were. So all of those things are coming to play, but overwhelmingly, you must absolutely consider the US market as one of the biggest drivers for investment activity in the startup world in Africa. The US is very interested in growth and very interested in what Africa has to play. And if you're a startup raising money, we're more than happy to help you out. But you absolutely have to focus on North America, particularly the US, as a key market. And what you also find on the Africa side, of course, there are a lot of funds that are domiciled and set up here, but some of them are possibly JVs or relationships that have either European or American or Asian headquarters as well. So not all the 35% is as clear from an Africa perspective. So if you want to just take the split and you look at what's happened in Q2, these are numbers again from Brighter Bridges. You'll see in Q2, March to end of June, about 41% came from investors in Africa. About just under 30%, call it 26%, came from North America, particularly the US. And the numbers are pretty much what I've just showed in the last slide. Those kind of figures where, North America, the indigenous African funds, make up about 65%. You'll find that's the kind of number that you're going to work with. Europe makes up another quarter, and the balance comes in drips and drabs, mainly in Asia. Places like Singapore have been active in as channels as well through various participants into Africa as well. And if you look at where the money is primarily gone, it's almost always the big four countries. Other than that one deal I mentioned in Benin, that was probably one of the ones off, I would say, but that's kind of where the money has gone in the last quarter. And if you take a bit of a snapshot and look at who's been very active as investors, and we mapped out here from the kind of database numbers we get in terms of who the top players have been by number of deals. Without a shadow of doubt, Launch Africa, I'm sure most of you guys would expect this, which is a VC firm, and I'll jump into the spreadsheet a little bit to give you guys the numbers. But Launch Africa has been super active because what they do is they raised I think it was about a $35 million fund, but they write pretty small checks to a lot of businesses across the continent. So some of these numbers, as you look at them, you probably see, ranks on deals. We don't get a lot of numbers from a disclosure perspective on exactly how much, but I think it's pretty important to also look at activity in terms of who's really signing checks. So Launch Africa is a firm that's domiciled in Mauritius, but based primarily, I think the principals in South Africa. Lots of, Zach and Junaid, who are, I would say, legends in the space, have been around in the space for a long time. They have a very widely dispersed team as well that sits across the continent. So they're able to write checks all across the continent. So they're on their second fund now. And I would absolutely tell you, if you're a startup and you are raising money, you've got a fantastic idea, you've got traction, and you're not speaking to Launch Africa for their fund too, come give me a shout and hopefully we can connect you. But yeah, they are very super active, and their second fund is much larger than the 30, call it 6 or 7, 37 million they launched in their first fund 2-3 years ago. So super active as well. You've seen another big participant coming from Google. And then maybe let me do this. I think it might help to show you guys the adjusted deals in terms of just the whole ranking, in terms of the top 20. So yeah, if you're a startup, I would take a screenshot of this if I were you and see if you can call these guys up, because these are guys that have been active, and I'll show you what's been active over the last sort of sooner. from the last quarter 4 or 5 years, Google, the fund, they've got a Black Founders Fund, has been super active as well. They've written about 140 checks into African startups. Interestingly, Y Combinator tech startups, some of the big names have been really active in Africa. And what also happens as well is that the kind of ticket sizes or check sizes Africa asks for is not as large as what you find in the developed world. So as a startup, when you're raising money, it also helps if you think bigger from the kind of ticket sizes. If you're going out, you're flying to the US to raise $1 million, it's not going to help you. Well, depending on your stage, I guess, because what that also does is that it sort of influences who you're speaking to from an investor pool. And secondly, what kind of minimums they're also looking for from these guys. So lots of activity in North America, as you can see. Some of the DFIs from the list I showed you, like DEG in Germany, very active. Keppel Africa Ventures is from Japan, but they've got a link up with Varod in Nigeria. And they're writing checks in Nigeria from Japan. So lots of this activity that probably a lot of people don't necessarily know that they can approach to sort of help. From a local perspective, Lofty Inc. also has a similar model where they write a lot of checks. It's a Nigerian-based VC firm. Sort of Flexix in Egypt, also super active. So lots of names. More than happy to also run you through some of these kind of names that have popped up. But what you're also going to find, names that don't pop up here are really large funds that have been raised, but that have maybe a much later stage focus. So the likes of Partech that have raised really large, call it $300 million dollar funds. But they play in the call it the growth or Series B, Series A kind of stage later, and you're not going to find them doing 160 deals, obviously, at that stage. So they're not going to pop up here. So this is about volume and not so much about value. And if you look year to date, in terms of what's been happening from January until now, these are some of the most active players. So if you want to get a check, if I were you, take a screenshot of this and I'll check to some of these chaps or ladies. DG is super active. MasterCard has been very active. I mentioned Launch Africa, which is on its second fund now. So they're actively deploying now. These are the kind of investors that you're going to get money from right now, given what's kind of happening. And then, lots of other people, you're finding even on the DFI side, USAID has been super active on some of their programs. They've been giving grants to funds, to fund managers through their mobilizing investment program. The DFC, which used to be the old OPIC, is also deploying money in startups. As you can see, they've done about 6 deals so far. Renew, based in Ethiopia, interestingly started, I think, by people who were in the US and came back home to Ethiopia. 6 deals so far. So lots of activity that's happening. If you look at people who've raised, and if you're in South Africa, I'll check you a little bit about who else has been raising or closing funds and active and so forth. Yeah. I'll jump into this so I don't waste too much time. I know we're going to run out of time. I talk a lot sometimes. But from what's also important to look at from an institutional investor's perspective in Africa is that you obviously don't have a lot of institutional investors who are playing in this space in Africa for various reasons. They're just probably not aware of what's happening. They're not allocating money. Even in South Africa, if you look at Regulation 28, people have a lot more leeway to give money to private assets, but they're still not doing it. So to kind of show you, if you look at the pension fund numbers by allocation, and this is an old number, I think it's about 2-3 years old from Euskura, but the numbers don't change much, is you're going to find that, for instance, on the far right, which is where South Africa is, there's a lot more money in the orange that's allocated to listed equity, and then of course bonds, listed bonds particularly, and a very small amount goes into alternative assets. If you take, for instance, a market like Kenya or Nigeria, a lot more money is in fixed income securities, and very little money, almost nothing, is in alternative assets. If there's any alternative, it's in property. And particularly listed property or REITs. You've seen Zambia now issue its first REIT. Kenya's obviously been in the REIT space for a while. So that's what you kind of find, and you find a lot of risk, aversion by pension funds in Africa into investing funds into startups and into venture capital. So looking at this allocation, and you can see the numbers. I mean, if you compare, let's just say South Africa, Botswana, Namibia, which are quite similar from an economy and asset allocation perspective, compared to the world, the bulk of the world, which is the bar that's on the far left. The bulk of the world is actually, nicely spread out. That blue part is in a lot of private equity and unlisted private credit, venture capital, and so forth, where Africa is still lagging. So all this slide is trying to show you is that if you're a startup trying to raise money, going to knock on retirement funds and pension funds, you're just going to waste your time. Come chat to us. I'm going to tell you, don't even bother. You're not going to get money until you get money through a fund that they have given money to. So don't bother. But what you're also finding, interestingly, is that some of these pension funds are giving money to new independent VC funds. So in South Africa, particularly from the SAFCA perspective, you kind of see that the bulk of VC activity is now driven by venture capital firms. Government, from the likes of CEDA, TIA, a National Empowerment Fund, all of those guys are starting to shrink quite a lot from the captive kind of funds they used to have, and all the little what they call venture capital funds they used to have. They started to shrink quite a lot. You do have a lot of captive money coming from corporates, but that's also not as large as you're finding. So literally 62%, I think the number now last year was about 62% of activity in the venture space was coming out of venture capital funds in South Africa particularly. So that's super important to kind of understand what's been happening, and also who to target, right? I just told you now, don't waste your time targeting pension funds, telecom pension funds, we can knock on their doors, but until they have an actual program that supports venture capital, they're not going to give you money. You're better off getting money from people who they give money to in this space as well. So lots of activity coming from VC funds in South Africa, and any of these numbers, just hit me up. I'm more than happy to share with you the background stats. So bringing it back, and I'm going to go through the big four markets, I guess. So if you look at some of the biggest investors that have had that are active or have been active since 2019 in South Africa, I don't know if a lot of people don't necessarily know much about CRE or CRE VC. Started by a gentleman called Pule Dalkubeng. I don't know whether he's still here who is still in South Africa in the US, but they've been super active investors, just under 30 deals over the years. Raba is actually a very interesting partnership that groups entrepreneurs. So you're going to find in Raba some ex-founders from Yoko, some little ex-founders from various very successful ventures that have come out of Africa that are partners in Raba, and then they sort of pulled their money to invest, and they've been super active. You need to know them as well. You need to knock on their doors. You kind of need to build those relationships, like I said, and in the first couple of slides, like getting money is like getting married. You're not just going to knock on somebody's doors and just say, let's get married. You need to date, you need to court them in a way. And if you want to raise money out of South Africa, I would really urge you to start building relationship with some of these guys who've been a little bit active as well. I'm not going to go into all of them, but we know the likes of Knife Capital, Cape Town based, done about 15 deals in over the last couple of years, but they've been around for much longer. I think they're now on their Fund 3. Naspers exited Foundry, but they did do their work in investing. 535 is almost in partnership with Launch Africa, so they tend to have they kind of a similar velocity in deals or number of deals they do. But what's also super interesting in South Africa is that a lot of traditional asset managers and banks are starting to invest directly in venture. So some of my my alma maters here, I see, Old Mutual through Future Growth have a fund. They don't necessarily call it a venture capital fund, but they have a fund that does venture. So they hold things like Sweep South. They invested in a lot of interesting startups that they've held in a while. Standard Bank is actively investing both as a fund of funds and as as an investor in startups directly. So raising money from the likes of Standard Bank is active, is possible now. Nedbank is at the bottom there with 7 deals, but Nedbank has actually almost always had a venture capital division that sits in Sandton in Johannesburg. That's super active as well. You're looking at the likes of Alan Gray, which obviously has a very strong entrepreneurial sort of background. Apologies, phone. And they're also very active through other sort of their wings or directly through their business as well. So lots of activity in South Africa. I'll tell you a little bit in a second about 1 or 2 funds that have just launched as well. But hit me up if you want to kind of get connected to some of these guys. If you have a good plan, that is, or you just want to learn a little bit more about what's going on in the space. So lots of activity from an SAE perspective. I'm not going to bore you with beautiful logos, but what's also interesting is that to look at who's actually just either closed funds and are actively deploying. So if you look in South Africa, a lot of the guys are now deploying their second or third funds, and you're finding the likes, for instance, as I've shown here, Knife Capital, as I said, is just closed a $50 million fund, which is a Series B fund. So they want to play more in the later sort of growth stages. Endeavor has been super active through their third fund through Harvest, the Harvest Fund third. Hawaii, which is Cape Town based as well, has just closed another $50 million. So when a lot of people say, look, I mean, who do I speak to as a VC? There you go. These are guys that actually deploy money right now. And I think the most important thing is to ensure that even if you are a startup raising money, to speak to guys at the right time, right? So it doesn't help you speaking to a fund that is just finished deploying their capital and we're only looking at another fund in 2 or 3 years. Speak to guys who are actually deploying if you meet their mandate, and also understand what they're looking for, how quickly they want to deploy, whether you are fit or not. Those kind of discussions are very important. Of course, from a fund of funds perspective, our biggest sort of SME fund has launched also about R1 billion or 55 or $50 million product as well. I think they announced at their first close they were I think at about 700 million. So they'll probably get to that final close quite soon as well, which means that the ecosystem can then get that $50 million back to deploy through various funds into South Africa as well. So very interesting activity. Nigeria, which is one of my favorite markets as well. Lots of interesting play in Nigeria as well. Without a doubt, Lofty Inc. Has been the most active player in that market from a number of deals perspective. So what you're finding in Nigeria is a very, I'm going to call it one very rich VC ecosystem where a lot of the VC firms, a lot of venture studios are really driving activity and investment. Future Africa, the ventures platform, all of these guys are super active in deploying capital into the ecosystem, particularly around the kind of pre-seed and seed stage kind of space. So what you find in Nigeria is a lot of activity happening in call it the early stage market. We probably had to see a lot more of like I've just showed you South Africa, where you have a lot more of this later stage Series B, Series C funds that are starting to pop up, but a lot of activity as well happening in Nigeria. So I'm not going to run through all of that. I'm seeing I'm running out of time, but I'm not going to run through all of them. If I were you, I'll just take a snapshot, or what do you call it? A shot of a screenshot of this. But lots of activity that we can connect you guys to. We track about 140, 150 investors in Nigeria, and I've just cut it off at the top 20 kind of thing. But lots of activity as you'll see from indigenous Nigerian companies. But what's interesting about Nigeria as well is when you rank a number of deals, you have a lot more North American businesses investing in Nigeria that necessarily overwhelm the local African players in that space as well. So that's quite important to see. If you move to East Africa and you look at Kenya, the Catalyst Fund, which is a clean tech fund, has been super active over the last, particularly more recently, in deploying in Kenya. So, Kenya has a lot of great opportunities around, clean energy, alternative sources of energy in Kenya that you probably don't have in other parts of Africa as well. Agriculture in Kenya is obviously a big driver. That also helps on the climate side of things as well, depending on how you do it. Things like carbon credits, those kind of businesses have attracted quite a lot of money in the East African region. So you're seeing, without a doubt, obviously Catalyst Fund is a relatively newer fund, and they have a similar model of writing lots of checks and getting super involved. Lots of other players here, as you'll see. I mean, Enza, very active as well in Kenya. I'm not going to run through all of them, but what's interesting to start seeing is, you start seeing kind of the Nairobi, the angel networks are starting to pop up in East Africa as well, which is, you'll see in a similar way, is similar to what you probably find in a market like Egypt, where the angel groupings play a lot more, interestingly, number of checks than you're seeing in a few other spots. And as you'll see, I mean, lots of DFI kind of play in some degree in Kenya, but very active ecosystem as well from a VC perspective. Very active. Probably, obviously, it is the hub and a key market for everybody in Africa. So you take a look at Egypt, as I've said, if you scan through Egypt, interestingly, you start seeing a lot more of the angel network starting to pop up. So Cairo Angels, as you see, is a big kind of a check writer in about 14 deals over the last couple of years. But you look at these numbers, you start to get a perspective, and I'm not going to go into all of them in detail. As I said, I mean, we'll share the recording of this presentation, or just take screenshots if you want. But certainly, you start seeing who the main players are, and as I said earlier, there are a lot more venture funds that are active in Africa, writing checks that are above in check sizes, and that's what these numbers are sort of capture as well. So a lot of activity in the space and in the venture space, and it's super important that a lot of people know not all of these venture funds make noise through TechCrunch or wherever, and it's important to be able to tap into who the guys are who are active but are doing so in a quiet way. All right, I don't know if let me just check if there are any questions or comments. None so far. Can we get the slides? Yeah, this is recorded, so I'll send you guys, definitely you'll get the recording, and yeah, you can watch it. I think we'll also put it up on YouTube to share it with the world. Yeah. So guys, I thought I'd just pause a little bit, because if you're raising money in Africa, you almost have to tap into this high net worth individual space. And I thought I'd chat a little bit about who they are and some of the latest research that we've picked up on kind of the trends that are happening in the, as I said, the state of the high net worth individual space. So typically here, I'm talking about people who've got liquid assets that are above $1 million. And this excludes their primary home, obviously. So your primary home, your all other assets, net of your liabilities is those kind of wealthy individuals I'm talking about. And then of course we also include the second batch, which is the ultra wealthy. So these are people who either have, you know, the centimillionaires that have over $100 million, or the billionaires, of course, speak for themselves. And out of the billionaire class, you only find about 3,000 billionaires in the world in total. So people who have liquid investable assets at about at $1 billion and above, and there are only 3,000 of them. And then, of course, there are, you know, lower class folks like me, who are, you know, generally defined as the middle class at 200K in liquid assets. I know probably some of us, or me on the call, we don't even make it with where some of our currencies are. But what's important to speak about here is that what you find as well is when there's this pool in the ultra wealth, or the, you know, the millionaire class, it also pulls the middle class as well, and that grows the investor base for venture capital as well. And that's what we've kind of seen in Dubai, where when a lot of people, wealthy people, move there, they move not just by themselves, but their secretaries, their accountants, and so forth, who also get an uplift in their wealth. So primarily, I'm not gonna. I see we're running out of time, but primarily, you're finding the bulk of millionaires in South Africa, with the second bit in Egypt, and then followed by Nigeria. And I'll chat a little bit about some of these numbers. But you've got about 137,000 wealthy people in Africa, interestingly. And that's important for you to know, because that's where, you know, some of the venture capital money comes from. You know, the wealthy reinvest in some of these startups, particularly in the developed world, and you've got to be able to map where that money is coming from as well. So you look at the numbers, there are about 135, as I said, just about 135,000 high net worth individuals in in Africa in totality. About 30% of them, 37,000 of them or so are in South Africa. And the other 30% is collectively in Egypt, Morocco, Nigeria, and Kenya, interestingly. So these numbers come out of the Africa Wealth Report that's published every year. Yeah, more than happy if you want me to you know, lead you to the main source, but very incredible reading. What's also important to note here is that there's been incredible migration by wealthy Africans into places like Dubai, where they are moving their money and they're moving their domicile into Dubai, into places like the UK and the US as well, driven by many factors, one of which has been the currency devaluation that we've seen in Nigeria, in Egypt, in Kenya, and of course in South Africa. All the currencies, if you look 5 or 10 years ago, are nowhere near where they were. You know, the rand was at some point 10 rand to the dollar. We're about 18 now. The naira, I don't want to speak about the naira, or, you know, the Egyptian pound. They've all devalued quite significantly, and you're finding a lot of people pulling their money out and putting it into other parts. And of course, what you're also seeing is a lot of newer hubs from a high net worth individual perspective, where places like Mauritius and Rwanda, particularly, just to give an example, Rwanda only has 1,000 high net worth individuals, people who have $1 million and above. And I can show you all other interesting numbers. The numbers are absolutely fascinating to kind of see where the money sits. But suffice it to say here, the point was, if we can just draw money from high net worth individuals, you know, just each of them giving us $100,000, we could unlock about, or $200,000, we could unlock, you know, $27 to $30 billion in venture capital funding. So this is a very notable market to tap into from a fundraising perspective. If you're in South Africa, which is obviously where I do a lot of my investment advisory work, it'll be fascinating for you to know, the bulk of, out of the, call it, 37 or number we have, K in South Africa, the bulk of them are either in Joburg and the Western Cape, as you would expect. But interestingly, you absolutely have to know where to go in South Africa. So places like the Garden Route, the Whale Coast, Hermanus, the Cape Winelands, Stellis, and all of that place outweigh the money you'll find in Cape Town, obviously, and outweigh what you'd find in Joburg as well. So very interesting numbers from what you see. So you find Cape Town is about 7,000, we'll call it 7,500 high net worth individuals. And yeah, lots of reasons why in South Africa, interestingly, you're actually not finding a lot of people moving out, but a lot of people internal migration. So there's a lot of Gauteng to particularly those 4 areas I mentioned: the Garden Route, the Whale Coast, the Cape Winelands, and of course the Cape Town CBD. And that wealth is moving away. So if you're looking for high net worth individuals as to who's investing in startups, come hit us up. I'll tell you, they are down in Hermanus. Go have a coffee in Hermanus, hang out there. Then that's probably where you're gonna get your money, than hanging out in Pretoria, for instance. I'm not mocking Pretoria, but just saying, you have to sort of know where the wealth is concentrated. From what you're seeing. But interestingly, the wealth report also speaks to the fact that they expect massive growth in the number of high net worth individuals over the next 10 years. I think they were quoting a silly number like 65%. I don't know if I believe it, but that's kind of the number they're looking at. And it's driven by, there are a lot more younger millionaires that are coming from things like fintech, the tech space, who are now becoming investors as well in the startup world. If you look, for instance, Aisha Pando, who started Sweep South, is now an investor in the South African ecosystem by herself, right? And a lot of other, Katla Kompai from Yoko, also used some of the money he's earned to come and invest in other startups as well. So it's super important that you keep an eye on who these wealthy people are. So I thought I'd just close up and looking at angel investors. I just wanted to leave a few minutes if folks had maybe if there are any questions to address. But just to look at lastly, we've looked at institutions, we've looked at high net worth, we've kind of seen some of the names. And as I say, I'm more than happy to share with you guys the list as they go below sub 20, as I said, we've got about, databases going up to about 130, 140 names of investors who are active or have been active in the startup world. And these are people who've invested $100,000 and above, right? So what I'm going to look at now are your angel investors, people who are investing below $100,000 and kind of who they are. So if you look, unfortunately, these numbers, on the angel investor side, the numbers are a little bit lagged. I know they're running a survey now of all the angels, but if you just look at numbers, for instance, from last year, you had about 2,000 active angel investors. And when I say active angel investors, I'm not talking about necessarily my uncle or my aunt who gives me money or my grandma, whoever. I'm talking about people who belong to angel networks. And I think there are about 35, actually quite a lot more. I think about 60 or even a little bit more than that, active angel networks that exist across the continent. And for instance, in South Africa, you'll be looking at Josie Angels as an example. In the list I showed you, names like Cairo Angels, who are individuals who come together to put money together and invest in startups. So you absolutely have to know who they are in each of your market. If you're in South Africa, Kenya, Cameroon, the Congo, very active angels exist as well. And this chart here on the far, so on the top left, just show you like the split. Most of them are really either executives at corporate level, or they're ex-founders or ex-entrepreneurs themselves. And those make up the bulk of, the investor profile of who's investing in startups. So if you're looking for money, as a startup, don't miss this step of maybe thinking about speaking to these high-earning executives at MTN, at GT Bank, at Safaricom, at wherever. He might be head of strategy here and making an incredible amount of money, but you just need to speak to them in the right way as an angel. And there's a lot of activity in that space as well. Lots of activity, as I said, in the ex-founder space. There we go. That's the number I was actually looking for. So there are about 68 angel networks that exist across Africa. Sorry, some of these numbers are very small, but the bulk of them, quite a lot of them in groups are in Nigeria, followed by South Africa, which is about 16 angel networks. And we're more than happy to connect you guys with any of these angel groups if you are raising money to kind of see, if you want to tap into them. But almost every country, I think Mozambique has only one. Even countries, very small nations like Cape Verde, have an angel network. So yeah, the profile super interesting. That you find check sizes that start from $1,000 going all the way up to way over $500,000 to $1 million. Are very small deals there, but very far ranging. But absolutely, the absolute number of check sizes you're gonna get from angels kind of ranging that $1,000 to $50,000 kind of range, and they provide very good capital because this is pre-seed money. Some of it is actually a sort of proof of concept, etc. And it's money that helps to bridge the system quite a lot. So depending on where you are in your investment race or your investment stage, you'd always want to have a look at all these angel networks. And as I've said, there are 68 of them as a network, guys. And there are, over 2,000 investors, very active investors in this angel space. So when people say, we don't know where to raise money in Africa, I'm like, okay, but have you looked hard enough? And a lot of people probably haven't, but there's certainly a lot of activity in the space as well. So just to close off, we have 2 minutes left, but just to close off on some of what the key challenges are. I mean, what we found as well is things like, educating the high net worth and institutional investor market about the activity in the VC space, what's happening, who's active. Those kind of education drives, I think, are super important for us to do as an ecosystem, particularly for us as the financial services space, in promoting or bridging this gap between funders and startups. Historic performance is a nightmare. You can't find any data on what funds are doing. Exits, it's super hard to get that data. So you kind of have to mine it. So insufficient data is also a big issue. I won't speak about currency, political, regulatory. We just saw what's happened in Kenya from some sort of political issues. We know what's happening in South Africa. We know what's happening in Egypt. I had a call earlier on with somebody in Cairo who was saying they because of the currency now they have load shedding, if you want to call it that, power blackouts that are happening an hour or two in Egypt. So we have similar issues, problems, South Africa, Egypt, Nigeria. Currency, political, regulatory instability is a massive issue. Integration also remains a big issue, that our markets are too fragmented. So when you're speaking to an investor in the US who wants to deploy capital, they want the size of the market. They don't care that South Africa is only 60 million. I mean, the GDP of South Africa is the GDP of Georgia as a state in the US, right? Even smaller than Georgia. 1 out of 50 states. And most GDPs in Africa only the GDP of a city in America. So that fragmentation also stops investors from engaging with a lot of funds, and of course, talent, legal, etc., etc. Some of the folks who might be on the call who know in the legal space, IP, where you domicile your stuff, IP is super important as well. When you come up with an innovation in South Africa, do you put it here or do you register it in Luxembourg or Dublin, or do you take it to Delaware? You know, those kind of issues around talent don't exist as yet in South Africa or in Africa broadly. You know, for instance, I'll give you a very simple, just to end the point, you know, to end the call as well. A safe agreement, which is what everybody uses, the YC innovation that everybody uses in the startup world. If you speak to a lawyer in South Africa and you present them with your safe agreement, you're going to start having a lot of issues when you start looking at company law and how company and common law are structured in South Africa, right? So does this thing sit under company law? Does it sit under common law? So there are all these things, nuances that are on talent and fundraising that are super important for us to deal with. Yeah. So I wanted to end there, guys, and thank you for your time. I see there are 1 or 2 questions, if you'll indulge me. I think I answered the first one, that yes, I will share the recording. So yeah, do investors in Africa have appetite? I think, you know, the particular discussion I've been having, or at least the startups I'm talking about are technology startups that are primarily asset light, so primarily software businesses. There are funds that are dedicated to manufacturing and asset-backed funding. So in South Africa, for instance, as 8th season, we deal with about 24 funders that provide traditional funding. So these are guys like Lulaland, Genfin, Pollen Finance that do manufacturing, but they're doing SME funding, which is very different to startup tech funding, which is what I'm talking about. So yes, there is capital, but yeah, we can always chat. Hit me up if you guys want my details. Hit me up on LinkedIn, whatever, and then we can always chat. But guys, that's all I wanted to say. I don't want to take up too much of your time, and thank you so much for your time and for joining me in the second quarter. And hopefully, I'm gonna bring you a third one again. This is the second one we're doing, and we'll do another one at the end of the third quarter as well. Thank you, guys, and thanks for all your questions and participation. And have a super great afternoon, morning, evening, wherever you are. Thank you so much, and take care.